The Vanishing Tent. It was supposed to be a fun weekend camping trip, a break from the bustle of city life. My friends and I had chosen a secluded spot deep in the woods, miles away from any signs of civilization. The first night was perfect. We set up our tents around a cozy campfire, shared ghost stories, and roasted marshmallows under the stars. Everything felt calm and peaceful, the kind of night where the only sounds were crackling wood and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. By the second night, though, something felt different. The air had grown still, too quiet, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. We all felt it, this subtle, creeping unease that none of us could quite place. Maybe it was just the isolation, we reasoned, or the eerie silence that came after the wind stopped. We laughed it off, determined not to let our imaginations get the best of us. Eventually, we all retired to our tents, tired from the long day of hiking and exploring. I must have drifted off quickly, the warmth of my sleeping bag lulling me into a deep sleep. But sometime in the dead of night I woke up, heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure why at first. There were no strange noises, no animals rustling through the underbrush. Just silence. That's when I noticed it. A faint glow from the fire outside, now barely smoldering, casting long shadows across the trees. But something was off. I squinted through the small mesh window of my tent, scanning the campsite. One of the tents was missing. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe my friend Sarah had moved her tent in the middle of the night for some reason. But as I crawled out of my tent, I saw the unmistakable sight of her belongings scattered across the ground where her tent had been. Her backpack was lying open, clothes strewn about haphazardly, and her flashlight was lying on the dirt, still on but flickering weakly. "Sarah," I whispered, glancing around the campsite. The others were still asleep in their tents, unaware of what I was seeing. Panic started to rise in my chest as I moved closer to where her tent had been. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away, no sound. It was as if the ground had swallowed her whole, taking her tent with her. I woke the others, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what I saw. They didn't believe me at first, groggy and confused, but when they saw the empty patch where Sarah's tent had been, their faces turned pale. "She wouldn't just leave," Mark muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Not without telling us." We searched the area, calling her name, but there was no response, only the oppressive silence of the woods surrounding us. The deeper we ventured into the forest, the heavier the air seemed to grow, thick with an unspoken dread. And that's when we found it, a single footprint in the mud just beyond the tree line. But it wasn't Sarah's. It was much larger, almost distorted, like it didn't belong to any human. Fear gripped me as I looked around, suddenly feeling like we were being watched. I could feel eyes on me, though I saw nothing but darkness beyond the dim glow of our flashlights. Whatever had taken Sarah, if something had, was still out there, lurking in the woods, watching us. We gathered back at the campsite, unsure of what to do. None of us wanted to admit it out loud, but we all knew something was terribly wrong. I tried to rationalize it, tried to tell myself that maybe Sarah had wandered off for some reason, but the absence of her tent and the scattered belongings made no sense. The hours stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent us into a frenzy, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But nothing came. As dawn approached, the unease never left. Sarah was still gone, and the realization hit me with full force. Whatever had taken her could easily take any of us next. The forest, once peaceful and serene, now felt like a predator, closing in on us. We left as soon as the sun began to rise, abandoning our campsite and any hope of finding Sarah. The entire hike back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, staying just out of sight. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving between the trees, something large and unnatural. but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Weeks passed, and search teams scoured the area for any sign of Sarah. They found nothing. No tent, no footprints, no trace that she'd ever been there at all. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. To this day, I can't explain what happened in those woods, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever took Sarah is still out there, waiting for its next victim. And I'll never step foot in those woods again. The Phantom Campfire. It was the perfect weekend for a getaway, and my friends and I decided to take advantage of the fall weather with a camping trip deep in the national forest. The drive was long, but once we arrived, the cool, crisp air and the vibrant colors of the autumn leaves made the journey worth it. We hiked for hours, finally settling on a remote spot near a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm glow through the branches as we set up our tents and built a fire. As night fell, the mood was relaxed. We laughed, shared stories, and roasted marshmallows, watching the flames crackle and dance in the fire pit. The stars shone brightly above us, and there wasn't a sound to be heard other than the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt like we were completely alone in the world, just us, the fire, and the forest. Around midnight, we decided to explore a bit before calling it a night. The moon was bright enough to light our path as we wandered further into the woods, following a narrow trail that we hadn't noticed before. After walking for about 20 minutes, we stumbled upon something unexpected, an old campsite. At first, it looked abandoned, just a few weathered logs arranged in a circle, some scattered trash, and a worn-out tent that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But then we saw it. A smoldering fire, still glowing faintly in the fire pit. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "That's impossible," I whispered, feeling a wave of unease wash over me. We hadn't seen any other hikers or campers all day. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. "Maybe someone left recently," Mark said, his voice sounding unsure. "But why leave the fire like that?" We approached cautiously, the flickering embers casting eerie shadows across the campsite. There was no sign of anyone, no fresh footprints, no gear, just that fire smoldering like it had been burning for hours. Something felt off, but none of us wanted to say it out loud. As we stood there, a faint sound caught my attention. It was soft at first, like distant voices carried on the wind. I strained to listen, but the sound grew louder. Laughter, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the trees. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My friends looked at each other, their expressions uneasy. "Yeah, but where's it coming from?" Jess asked, turning in a circle to scan the area. The laughter continued, growing closer, yet there was no one in sight. I felt a chill creep up my spine. The air around us had grown colder, and the once calming night now felt suffocating. The fire's glow seemed unnatural, casting twisted, dancing shadows on the trees. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, watching us. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, replaced by a thick silence that weighed heavily in the air. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I swallowed hard, feeling an overwhelming urge to leave, to run back to our own campsite as quickly as possible. "We should go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." Without another word, we turned and started walking back the way we had come. But the moment we left the clearing, the sound started again, this time much closer. Footsteps crunched behind us, though none of us dared to look back. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, like invisible eyes were following our every move. We quickened our pace, but the footsteps matched us, always staying just a few feet behind. My heart raced as I forced myself to keep looking ahead, even as the laughter returned, low and haunting, drifting through the trees. When we finally reached our campsite, the footsteps stopped, and the laughter faded into the night. We scrambled back to the fire, our breaths ragged, and collapsed onto the ground, too terrified to speak. For a long while, none of us said a word. The once comforting warmth of our own campfire now felt foreign, as if we had brought something back with us from that eerie clearing. We didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the trees, every whisper of the wind, sent a jolt of fear through us. And though none of us spoke about it again, I knew we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever we had heard, whatever had been watching us, it wasn't human. When dawn finally broke, we packed up our gear in silence, eager to leave the forest behind. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following us, hidden in the shadows, watching from a distance. To this day, I don't know what we encountered at that abandoned campsite. But I've learned one thing. There are some places in the woods that are better left undisturbed. The Forgotten Campers. We were a group of 6, eager to escape the bustle of the city for a weekend of camping. The plan was simple. Hike into the forest, pitch our tents, and spend the next couple of days enjoying nature without a care in the world. The spot we chose was tucked deep in a national park, a place that promised serenity and isolation. Little did we know that it also had a dark past. The first day was perfect. The sky was clear, and the hike to our campsite was picturesque, with tall trees towering over us and the scent of pine filling the air. We arrived at a clearing by late afternoon, where we set up our tents and built a fire as the sun dipped below the horizon. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, laughing and sharing stories. The fire crackled warmly, and the stars above seemed impossibly bright. It wasn't until the fire began to die down that things took a strange turn. One of my friends, Jake, wandered off to collect more firewood. After he'd been gone for what felt like too long, I stood up to call out to him. But just then, he returned. Only, something about him seemed off. His face was pale and his eyes were wide, as if he'd seen something he couldn't explain. "Guys," he said quietly, "I saw someone in the trees. They were just standing there, watching." We all exchanged uneasy glances. This deep in the forest, there shouldn't have been anyone else around. "Maybe it's another camper," I suggested, though even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as a cold breeze swept through the clearing. Jake shook his head. "No, they were different. They didn't move. They just stood there, staring." None of us were eager to investigate, so we huddled closer to the fire, trying to brush off the encounter as Jake's imagination playing tricks on him. But as the night wore on, more unsettling things began to happen. I was the first to notice the shadows. At first, I thought it was just the flickering of the fire, but then I realized the shadows were moving in ways that didn't match the flames. There were figures, dark, human-like shapes, just beyond the light of our campfire, circling us. I nudged my friend Emily, pointing toward the shadows. Her eyes widened in fear as she whispered, "Are those people?" At first, I didn't want to believe it, but the longer I stared, the clearer they became. There were at least 3 figures, barely visible in the darkness, watching us from the trees. Their forms were hazy, as if they were fading in and out of existence. Suddenly, one of my friends, Laura, gasped and pointed toward one of the figures. That's the woman who disappeared last year. I saw her photo on the news." The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. The stories of people going missing in these woods weren't just rumors. We were staring at them. Campers who had vanished without a trace, now reduced to eerie, shadowy figures haunting the forest. Panic set in as we scrambled to pack our things, but the shadows remained, growing closer with each passing minute. We could feel their presence, a cold, oppressive weight pressing down on us. It was as if they were trying to communicate with us, but no words came, just silence and fear. "Do you think they're trying to warn us?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "Or are they trying to make us disappear too?" None of us had an answer, but the question hung in the air like a dark cloud. The realization that these shadowy figures might be former campers, people just like us, who had met a terrible fate, filled us with dread. Were we next in line to vanish, becoming part of the forest's dark history? The shadows never got too close, but they followed us as we rushed through the trees, desperate to escape. I could feel their eyes on us, their presence growing colder with each step. It was as if they were trying to pull us into their world, a world where time had stopped and the living became nothing more than forgotten echoes. When we finally reached the car at dawn, we collapsed inside, our breaths ragged, our hearts pounding. As we sped away from the forest, I glanced back and saw them one last time, those figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching us go. They didn't follow, but I knew they were always there, waiting for the next group of campers to wander too far into the woods. To this day, I can't shake the memory of their eyes, the silent warning they seemed to offer. We were lucky to leave that forest, but others might not be so fortunate. The campers who vanished long ago are still out there, trapped in the woods, and they're not alone.